We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
COVID relief policies led to rampant fraud and huge fiscal mismanagement. So reveals a new report that is in the throes of trying to assess what happened to the billions of unaccountable dollars. Now, Liberty Nation's economics editor, Andrew Moran, has been tracking the waste and the story, and he joins us today. Good to have you on board, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the figures, Andrew. How many taxpayer dollars have so far been lost to fraud?
Well, my recent reporting, the main story was the Small Business Administration reporting that it lost around $200 billion in, quote, potentially fraudulent COVID relief payments. Now, this accounted for nearly a fifth of all COVID-related payments they made. So this reminded as soon as I saw the headline of the story, it reminded me of the old Milton Friedman adage of there's 4 different ways that you can use taxpayer money: spend it on yourself, spend it on somebody else, use somebody else's money on yourself, or use somebody else's money on somebody else, which essentially confirms that, there's no accountability whatsoever. And what's funny too is that the report admitted that they discovered that there was fraud as early as May 2020, but it was already too late for them to stop the fraud from occurring. I thought that was comical.
So that's $200 billion in one program. Now, there are obviously many other programs that sent out various checks or provided loans to. I was doing the quotation marks there, certain loans. And do we know yet if there was rampant fraud within those programs as well?
Well, actually, many governments, many federal departments and state departments have issued reports saying there's been fraud occurring. I mean, the the Department of Health and
Human Services
hub, they said there was fraud. The Health and Human Services, there was fraud. Yep. The Paycheck Protection Program, that was rife with fraud. So there were all these different schemes occurring within the United States during the early days of the pandemic of people taking advantage of the system. And that was something that Liberty Nation actually warned about, what would occur. So, 3 years later, many of the reporting has been vindicated. And I'm sure as the years go by, there's going to be even more reports and investigations showing even more billions of dollars in frauds. Because there was a report recently done by, I think it was the Associated Press, and they compiled some of the reports that occurred, and they found that at least $123 billion was misspent or wasted. So that's the state of the COVID era spending that occurred.
So how did these frauds take place?
Well, so there was a variety of different ways that
I'm not looking for personal suggestions, just some basic reporting, if you could.
So one of the main highlights of some of these reports was that there was this Army soldier in the South, and that individual scammed the system 150 times and got $3 million from the U.S. government. It was done mainly by flooding the system with all these applications and, I guess thousands of applications, and then, hoping that at least 10% would be approved. And that's exactly what occurred. Other things include national kickback schemes, national telemarketing schemes, stolen identities, fictitious emails. So when there's free money at hand, people are going to come up with innovative ways to utilize that system to their advantage.
So you wrote in the recent article on this on the page of libertynation.com that waste and fraud, it's practically, I guess, axiomatic when the government gets involved. Could you explain that for us?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, before the whole COVID-19 public health crisis occurred, the U.S. government, whenever it has a stimulus or relief program, it's going to be rife with fraud because there's no accountability whatsoever. It's not their money that they're using. They're using the taxpayer dollars. And also another important point too is that Law's report mentions that, there was so much frenzy and chaos in the early days of the pandemic, and the government just set up these programs out of nowhere, and there wasn't planning or logistics being involved in there. So you can't really blame them for what transpired. But I think when you're spending $4.5 trillion, and this is one of the biggest governments in the world, I think there should be at least a modicum of safeguards and protections of U.S. dollars, U.S. taxpayer dollars. The Small Business Administration and the OIG, they put forward a couple of suggestions after the fact, saying you can strengthen controls by confirming loan deposits. You can partner with the Treasury Department on this do not pay portal. You can obtain photo identification. So all these things, it's great that they have these ideas now, but where were they?
Andrew, don't you know photo identification is racist? Don't you know that? It must be fought at every step, according to many in Washington, D.C. You know, I think this is one of the lessons that has come out in the wake of this recent fraud report, that when government gets involved in I mean, this is something that has happened since the beginning of governments, but when a government gets involved in distributing other people's money, or OPM, if anybody remembers the Danny DeVito movie, it has a way of just not getting to the people or the projects that it sets out to allegedly benefit. And I think part of that has to be because there's no personal accountability. So let's say there's a congressman representing District X, and he votes to give $100 to everybody within his city. Now, let's say there are 10 people in his city, and 15 go out. He's not personally responsible for the extra $500 that's gone out in fraud. And so he has there's not going to be any pushback against him personally. And I think that's almost symptomatic of an entire government approach. There's no personal responsibility required or accountability.
Also, another thing worth pointing out too is that if I'm a large company, I have the resources to access all this relief. I have the manpower, I have the documents, I have the infrastructure to do it. If I'm a small business of 2 or 3, and I have to go through all of this legwork, I have to go through all these regulations to access this funds. So that's another important part of the discussion. The other important part of the discussion too is that all these relief and stimulus programs, they're always targeted towards certain sectors of the economy. So we're going to discuss later on the show, but let's use the green economy, for example. In the early days of all this green funding under the Obama administration, you had Solyndra and all this tens of billions of dollars are allocated to these green firms. And what happened? They crumbled and failed. So there's no accountability of distributing the funds and also ensuring that the funds are being adequately used for its purpose. So Solyndra, that was completely incompetent. It was mismanaged, and that money just went down the toilet.
But this kind of happens almost every time we get a government program, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's hard to justify any type of government program. And I also think of the other Milton Friedman adage that there's no such thing as a permanent program as a temporary government spending program.
Yeah, I think Ronald Reagan said something similar. The closest thing to immortality is a temporary government program, something along those lines. So one quick final question for you, Andrew. Should the COVID-20, for example, raise its head, or some other global health challenge, do you think the same processes will be implemented again, or will lessons have been learned?
Lessons are never learned in governments. There's another Milton Friedman. This show is becoming the Milton Friedman show right now.
If we could get him on, we would.
People always learn. Governments never do.
And on that note, Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.